So welcome, Neil. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you both for having me.
So I hear you have a very interesting backstory with the topic that we're going to cover today, which is basically storytelling, communication, having power-packed sentences, being clear about your message, not being timid. So why don't you just start us off with how did you even get into any of this?
Well, I appreciate the question, Liz. And as a communication expert and a person with a background in book publishing, I'm supposed to say, oh, I was a real bookworm growing up and I always had my face in a book and so on and so forth. Went to Duke and had a 4.0 as an English literature major, something like that. And it's so the opposite of what actually happened. I hated reading from about second grade on. My dad would say, as soon as you got your first book report and reading became work, you just never did it again. And I suffered for it. My first time taking the SATs, I got a 330 verbal score. And that put me in like the 5th percentile, as in 95% of the other people who took the SATs did better than me. But as I finished up college, I started discovering reading for leisure, like light fiction, because a buddy of mine got me into it. And then he gave me a much more substantive work of fiction called A Prayer for Owen Meany by John Irving. And because of certain things that happened in that story, I went through this whole worldview shift, as in it just shattered what I thought I knew about life. And I just spent several years reading everything I could find to figure out how the written word could have had such an impact on me. Mm-hmm. And that got me my job at Penguin, and that got me started with everything, working on books and then public speakers and all forms of communication.
Wow.
That's fascinating. And coming from someone who is still a reader, but I read a lot less. And that was going to college made me read less because I can't. It's just like reading all that stuff. But I used to read for leisure. That's such a fascinating story because I believe in the power of the written word as well. I have an immense love for the written word and the spoken word, of course. But but I love to hear that. So we're going to be talking. You have a specific method that you say is really helpful to help people be clear in their messages and when we're speaking and we're delivering information. Given your background and your experience, what mistakes do you find that people tend to make when they're delivering messages? And please take this however you want to take it, whether it's written, verbal, whatever.
Of course. And probably the good news, I was about to say the bad news, but the good news actually is that the mistakes are pretty consistent across many forms of communication. Right. And that's good news because it helps simplify how to do something different. And what we see, whether a person is a public speaker or they're giving their elevator pitch, just 30 seconds or a minute about what they do, or even writing an article or going even deeper and writing a book, what I find is that by and large, people are so wrapped up in their solutions, their knowledge, their information, all the stuff, that they just do the show up and throw up. They just vomit all of this stuff out to people, especially in spoken form. When you go to a keynote speech and someone takes their whole 5 or 7 step process and crams it into a 45-minute speech, or if someone asks, hey, what do you do? And you launch into an elevator pitch. Oh, well, I'm a this who does this, and I do this, and this. And there's lots of jargon, lots of technical terms and stuff. And the person who asked the question just kind of glazed over and they're like, oh, thanks, I'll see you around, kind of thing.
They've checked out, yeah.
Yeah, they space out, check out, because it's usually boring, right?
Exactly. So the recurring theme is that people focus on themselves, and their message is just about what they're trying to do and what they think they should be talking about and all of that. But ultimately, effective communication values the recipient over the sender. Okay. That means that if we have an opportunity to give our elevator pitch, that we're going to be far more impactful if we think about how can the next 30 seconds or a minute or however long it is really empower the other person to somehow consider an idea, a different possibility, or even a new way of looking at things. And if we're a public speaker, how can we get up there and make every decision from the point of serving our audience so that they get so electrified by what we said that not only are they able to live a richer life in response, but then they want to go deeper with us as the expert. It's like, oh, tell me more.
Okay, excellent. So here's what popped into my head as you said that. I was like, oh, my organizational behavior book was right. That was number one. And then number two was, okay, so right now, because I know Liz really well, we've been working together for a year and a half, a little more than that, almost 2 years. Jesus, almost 2 years. I can now craft a message that I believe Liz will hear and receive, right? Because we've been working together for so long. But for most of us, when we're speaking and we're delivering messages, we're delivering it to unknown people, right? People we do not know, people we have no relationship with. Right. How then can we know what is important to them, what they value, so that we can craft our messages to them?
There was a time a number of years ago when my father, he was a retired school teacher, but was substitute teaching just to keep busy. And the principal at the high school he was subbing at refused to give keys to the subs for the classrooms in which they taught. And so they couldn't unlock the door to let them in. So they had to wait out in the hall with the custodial until the custodial staff came and let them in with all the students. And there was actually a lockdown at one point where there was a threat of violence, which unfortunately is becoming more and more common in our schools. And there were kids who fled the classroom that he was in or other subs were in because they just didn't they just didn't feel safe in that classroom and all of that. But my dad was really angry about just the fact that he had to wait out in the hallway, and he was a bit of a rabble rouser when he was a teacher, but thankfully he had tenure, so he wasn't at risk of losing his job. And so he had kind of a confrontational manner in demanding change and all of that. And he asked me about what he should write to the principal before, like he showed me what he wrote. He asked me to look at it. And it was that kind of confrontational, rabble rousing kind of thing. But instead of him talking about being embarrassed or that his authority is undermined, which is really what was on his mind and all of that, I had him write the email that was all about this kid's safety. The first line of the email was, "We are a group of subs who have concerns for the safety of our students." Okay. Now, the reason I took you guys through that story is because what most people do when trying to answer the question, how do I speak to the people I don't know, or someone who I, like you just said, Lisa, with you and Liz, you don't know as well or something like that. And what I had him do at the beginning of that email was speak about his message, his stuff, which was getting a key, from the perspective of the person he was writing, but more specifically, the problem that the principal cared about solving. His goal was to get a key, but instead of saying, "I'm so embarrassed,
give me a key.
Give me a key, and I'm locked out and have to wait for the custodial staff," I had him start with the safety of the students, because that's a problem the principal cared about. And the next day, the principal saw him in the hallway and said, "I hear you, let's meet." And then they got keys for the subs. And so this becomes a very important part of influencing those who are not in our inner circle, is that we start our messaging not from our message and our solution, but rather the problem that our audience cares about solving. And this helps with all sorts of things. That was an email to a colleague. It helps in our elevator pitch. It helps in our public speaking, writing a chapter or an article, like a chapter of a book or an article or anything like that. What you do when you start with the problem that your audience cares about is that they get immediately invested in hearing what's next. It's so simple, but it's overlooked because we're so wrapped up, like I said at the beginning, with what we have to talk about, that we just bypass our audience's needs and go right for what we want to talk about.
Right.
We don't do that on this podcast.
Yeah, exactly. If you're just talking about yourself, "Oh, I did this and this, and this is what I'm all about," people don't give a shit. They want to just know if what you have or what you're saying can help them on some level.
That's right.
So then that brings me to, how do I know what's important to them? Right. So in your dad's story, it's very interesting because you're able to sort of divine, because of who your audience member is, what's important to them. Right. But in a situation where I'm meeting a random person at a God, hopefully a networking event or a conference or whatever, some random person. I don't know jack diddly about you. So
Sure.
how do I know what's important to you when you ask me, hey, who are you, Lisa? What do you do?
Well, let's say you're at some random conference that aligns all sorts of people from all walks of life, and you are a data systems manager for a startup company, and you're all about creating a central nervous system of shared information among the company.
I checked out.
Yeah, exactly.
I know. As soon as I heard
I was
data systems, I'm like,
And let's say you were talking to a freelance massage therapist. Okay. And so if you start talking about the problem, well, the problem at our company is that we have this sort of thing. We don't share information, all of that, right? She's going to probably check out. Let's say the massage therapist is a woman.
oh, there's Lisa over there. I'm sorry.
Go, you know what? I think I need to get a drink now.
All right. So we've found a pretty big chasm there between the speaker and the listener, right? At a certain level, what you do is going to probably disconnect with a certain population, depending on how general or specific your work is, right? But if you're talking to someone, you might work them up incrementally to getting to the place where they understand some context for what it is. So you know how so this is me pretending that I'm the data person, right? You know how startups, like startup companies, they're just getting going and nobody knows what anyone else is doing. It's like, oh yeah, totally. Yeah, I have a cousin who's at a startup. They flame out so quickly. Yeah, exactly, right. And so a lot of things that people do to create cohesion is that they might have lots of meetings, they might do this and do that kind of thing. It's like, and the person is still with them, hopefully, right? But what I do is related to something most people don't really understand at all, and please don't feel bad if you don't understand it either, but what I do is help to create that cohesion with the information that everyone shares, the data, so that if everyone is using the same information, at the very least, everyone's speaking the same language, kind of thing, okay? So it doesn't mean that you're hungry to learn what's next, but if you're a data systems person talking to a massage therapist, what are you gonna do? What I did in that particular case is I just very lightly and incrementally got them to the point of understanding what is the larger goal, what is the larger purpose or intention, how does what you do have a positive impact? And the problem is to create that cohesion at a startup. So does it guarantee that everyone's going to be fascinated? No, but at the very least, they'll stay with you a little bit just to get a sense of it. And so when you talk about it, finally, at the end of all, they say, so I'm a data systems manager, and that I make sure that all the information is collected and all of that.
Right.
And just for the record, everyone, I just made those examples up on the fly. So you got to see me kind of in the hot. No, I didn't even I just went for the most obscure thing that no one except data people cares about.
Right.
And so hopefully we did all right with that.
No, well, we stayed with you. I certainly did.
I did too. So, okay. So you want to craft an elevator speech, right? So you're at a conference. Usually people there's a common theme if you're all at a conference, let's just say, and you're crafting your elevator speech around, say you're a business coach, and you don't want to talk too much about I'm this and I'm that, whatever. So what should somebody, how can somebody incorporate, say, like a story? You're a good storyteller, we could see just from that. What if someone is not a good storyteller? How can you incorporate storytelling and also solving a problem that they might have, or just keeping them engaged?
Storytelling is an interesting point to make, Liz. And when it comes to an elevator speech in that super short kind of 30-second kind of way, my guess is that the formality of storytelling it's a tricky thing to do. If somebody's not very gifted as a storyteller, it might be a tricky thing, because I also feel that the tone and formality of what you say ideally aligns with the formality of the situation. Like a public speaker is in a very formal setting. They're going to be up there for 45 minutes giving a speech on stage. That's very formal. A book or an article, it's laid out in advance and copy edited and stuff. So it's also very formal. if you're just talking to a person, the risk there in getting too laid down and like caught up in a story is that it might be formal to the point that people check out because the situation didn't seem to call for such formal communication. But that being said, you could, if someone asks you what you do and you want to bring storytelling into an elevator speech, you could just do what we could call like a 2 or 3 sentence story just to provide a little context. Like I know of this startup company that they got hacked and everything just fell apart overnight, and it took them 3 weeks to get back up and running again and get back to business. That was a super quick story, right? So you could do, if you can pull off just a 2 or 3 sentence thing where crisis happens and the fallout from that crisis is laid out, then that's a very nice, simple, bite-sized story that you could possibly play with. But in the case of that kind of more informal conversation, I'd say keep it to something super concise like that, because that could set up the problem as well.
Yeah.
Right.
So you keep kind of talking about the problem, right? And I get the sense that I think kind of where my head is in terms of what I'd like to know from you is sort of like, okay, the silver bullet technique that you talk about, clearly the problem sounds like it's the first piece, right? So what are the next pieces? And then sort of in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, great. You kind of showed us how we apply that to an elevator pitch. So how do I then apply it to a longer speech, maybe a public speaking engagement, and then written form, like an article, right? How do you kind of lay that out? If I'm right in thinking about what I'm thinking here.
Yeah, well, the really cool thing.
I said that so eloquently, by the way.
Oh, you're doing great. You're doing great. So the good news here is that the same basic structure can be applied to an elevator speech. It can be applied to a full speech, an article, or any of the other things that we've been talking about. And that we can break it down into 4 parts. The first part is the problem, as we've already talked about, the problem the audience cares about, or you can get them to care about, as we've discussed today. The next step is the typical solutions. Like at the beginning of our conversation today, I started talking about the show up and throw up and the things that people typically do that are flawed. Because what that does is that steers people into thinking, oh, is this a solvable problem? Because everything we've tried in the past doesn't really work so well. And then when you've laid those 2 parts out, then you hit them with what you already identified, Lisa, as the silver bullet, which is something I'll describe in a moment. But it's this, in short, it's just basically a 1-sentence secret sauce like recipe for the success that you create for your people. So you hit them with the problem, then the typical things that don't work, and then here's the secret sauce behind what does work. And that's the 3rd part. And then the 4th part is just describing what you do. And so if you have a full speech, you could start, I mean, there are other things I'm skipping over, more detailed parts. I like to use stories in the speeches I help my clients to put together and all of that. So it might start with the story and all that, but basically the skeleton of the speech is you start with the problem that the audience cares about, then you identify typical solutions that haven't worked. You then you basically build up to the silver bullet-like statement, and then you take them maybe through some practical tips or exercises, the what, like this is what you can now do to make this idea work for you.
Oh, can you try it?
Yeah, I was going to say, I have a good example. Do you have an example too, Lisa?
No. I was going to say, can we actually try it? Like I was going to try it, but an example might be better. Go ahead.
Well, okay, so
go ahead, Neil.
Okay, go ahead, Neil.
Well, I don't want to interrupt you, Liz, if you had a specific thing to say.
Well, I was going to say, so for me, my business, so I'm a coach and I'm also a small business owner, but in terms of coaching, I want to start doing more public speaking events and that type of thing. And what I like to talk about is the inner critic and the inner judge. Those are two kind of parts that we all have that I like to focus in on first. So given that, how would you, if I were, say, your client, how would you start helping me frame that around the silver bullet technique?
What would you say is the typical thing that when somebody is confronted with their inner critic, what would you say that most people typically do when confronted by that aspect of themselves?
They try and push it out.
Push it out. And
They
what,
try and
yeah, like just
get
squash
rid
it.
of it.
Get rid of
Squash it, go
Ignore,
away.
act like it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So
Get the hell
then,
out of my head.
what would you say is the antidote, the antithesis of that, the true thing that you want them to do instead?
To embrace it and befriend it.
Okay, and so embracing it gets us what exactly? Like how, when befriending the critic, what do we learn? What do we gain? How do we grow from that?
So looking at it through the internal family systems lens, this part of us actually is there to protect us and was birthed at a pretty young age, hoping that using its harshness, it's there to actually protect us against further hurt and trauma.
All right, so embracing and befriending it, does that
is not typical. It's not a typical idea that people usually think about. They usually want to get rid of it. And this is the notion that to befriend it and hear its story actually unburdens it. And it can be transformed into more of a cheerleader or more of a something different than this job that it typically does and has been doing.
Okay, so this could go any number of different ways, but the basic, the heart of the silver bullet concept is what we could basically label as a cause and effect sentence. When you take one action, you get one outcome. Like line 18 of the first chapter of The Art of War by Sun Tzu. It's been around for 2,500 years and people are still quoting it. And he says, all of warfare is deception. Okay, if you want to win a war, that's the outcome. You deceive your opponent, that's the action. Okay, and so, and I'll provide as many examples as you both would like to hear from silver bullets that happen on the TED stage, happen in books, happen in Aristotle, whatever it is. This one technique's been showing up for thousands of years, and so it's really quite juicy when you stop and notice it. But in terms of what you said, Liz, what we have there is like, and there are all sorts of ways to write the silver bullet, but a key format is to start with the key to achieving goal is not flawed solution, but rather true solution. And so the key to addressing your inner critics is not to squash them and push them away, but rather to embrace them as a way. Let me see if this needs more. It's very subjective, so it's tough to say, but rather to embrace them, so as to embrace them as a teacher toward, how could you just refresh my memory there? Like being a teacher to, what does befriending them really do? It's just like really helps them.
Having them witnessed, and this part maybe offering up, it's kind of like a whole therapeutic modality. There's different steps, but basically in the nutshell is there's a story that this critic originally sort of began, and it's usually through some kind of trauma, right? So it's like, you're never going to do this ever again. This will never happen ever again, because you never want to feel what you felt back there at that time. So that's usually the critic's main message in most of us is that was really, it's very harsh, because it thinks that that part of us thinks that that's how it's going to get our attention. And then the more we push it away, actually, the more harsh the voice becomes.
So then maybe I'm going to call an audible, if everyone and our listeners can forgive me. I'm not going to do the key to this or that or what thing. I'm actually going to try a different format for the silver bullet. It could be something like, the more we befriend our inner critic, the more enriched our ability to overcome trauma will be. Or the richer, something like that. Or maybe, something like that.
The more we'll be able to unburden some of that, our pain that we're carrying, or something to that effect.
Yeah, exactly. So it's that second half of the sentence I'd feel would benefit from some refinement, but somewhere in there is that idea that the more we befriend,
the less harsh it will be, actually.
Less harsh it will be, the more empowered we'll be from its wisdom, or something like that. Mm-hmm. Like it's like that's where I want everyone to recognize, and our listeners to understand, that you get the idea first, which, Liz, to your credit, you were already very clear on before we started talking. And then the rest of it just becomes kind of like a wordsmithing exercise.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
And so if we think about your elevator speech, for example, you could start with the problem, which is fairly evident, just like you ever get burdened by that inner critic that's always
You ever experience imposter syndrome? You ever
imposter
experience
syndrome? Exactly. There you
something
go.
simple like
You
that's
got
something
it.
that we all, kind
Right.
of
Judging yourself for
judging
not being
yourself, feeling like you're not good enough.
right, exactly. You ever have those moments where you're judging yourself for not feeling good enough? It's like, yeah. And usually what we do is we squash it. We try to push it away. So that's the typical solutions. But the more we befriend our inner critics, the more enriched our blank will be, or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Whatever the second half of the sentence is. So that's the first three parts. And then you, Liz, would say, and as a business coach or as a coach, are you specifically, would you say business, or is it more inclusive?
No, I'm more of a self-leadership coach. Yeah.
Yeah. So then you could then describe yourself as such after you've created that context with the first three parts, and take as long as you want to describe it. Just that taking those first 15 seconds to set context for your work as a coach, that winds up being just a way to help people get a bit more invested with not many more words on your part.
Yeah, I like that. I like the silver bullet technique in that way. And then would one then put in a personal story? Would you suggest and recommend that?
I mean, again, it depends on the context. If it's just a casual conversation, you might do the first three parts and then say, and so I'm a coach that helps people with this sort of thing, much like someone I just helped, by the way, she was really struggling with imposter syndrome, yet she was a C-suite executive at a Fortune 500 company. And so we just did a little bit of work, and within 3 months she had had this amazing outcome, kind of thing, something like that.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, I like that.
Whatever.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be very elaborate. In fact, for informal, casual conversations, I encourage you not to make it too elaborate.
Yeah. So I get the sense, I think that that was kind of what I was after with the exercise. So I get the sense that the silver bullet can be different, because in that kind of thing that you just did with Liz, you mentioned the key to X, Y, and Z is blah, 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 but then you changed it around. So are there multiple sort of silver bullet approaches, or is there really just the one?
Yeah, when I teach people that stuff in my programs and all of that, I give them 7 different formats that they can try. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of, a lot of it just winds up being brainstorming and seeing what feels right. And you can try it in different ways and see what gets people to really stand up and notice and all of that. And there are lots of different ways you can test the effectiveness of it, the language of any given one. But at the end of the day, because it's communication, we're dealing with the nuance and sometimes intricacy that a single word being changed can make a difference. One of my favorite silver bullets started as one thing, and then I had this moment, this is for a client, where she ran a reading and book gifting program at a children's hospital out in LA. And the original silver bullet was just very simply, words can heal. Mm-hmm. And that's technically true with book reading and all of that, because books have words in them. But then, spoken. With that?
I said both spoken.
Spoken, yeah, exactly. But the thought I had soon after was, wait a minute, it's not about words. It's a little more specific. It's about literacy. Mm-hmm. And so that one word changed, and then her silver bullet became literacy can heal. Mm-hmm. It's just 3 words. And because we found that silver bullet for her, it was because she was going to be on TV and she needed to get her responses to a question super concise, but then she was going to give a 10-minute talk a few weeks later. And I happened to I was volunteering at the hospital at the time. And that's how I knew her. And that's how she became a client. And she was all flustered and didn't know what she was going to say at this 10-minute presentation, because people just zoned out and just politely clapped at the end usually. But I took her aside and we talked about what to say instead. Mm-hmm. And she went off and did the thing. She had him held rapid attention from the moment she started speaking. And a bunch of them came up with business cards at the end. And one of them even invited her to apply for a grant. There was no polite clapping at all. But the thing about that story is that because of the silver bullet and the clarity we had from her secret sauce, that conversation I had with her only took 2 minutes. 2 minutes, we completely made over her presence as a speaker. And it's not because I'm such a big deal. It's because that clarity was so important for bringing all the other elements of the messaging together.
Yeah.
Can we just grab the silver bullet one last time, just in case people didn't hear it up front, like the general shape of it?
Yeah, while there are different formats, the simplest one that's easiest to plug into is the key to blank is not blank, but rather blank. And so I'll fill that in for you. The key to achieving some goal or solving some problem is not the typical way that most people do it, but rather this true way of doing it instead. And so not that I use this silver bullet for myself in that format, but I'll plug something in as an example, in that the key to effective communication is not talking all about your stuff and your solution, but rather talking about what will benefit your audience.
Excellent, excellent. And why do we think it works? Because, this whole conversation, I've been paying attention, I'm honing in, and I'm like, this is really great. And I'm thinking of ways that I could use it. So why do you think it works so well?
I have a very specific answer to that question, Lisa, in that we can look at a famous TED Talk by a man named Dan Pink, who did a talk a little over 10 years ago on the puzzle of motivation. And 2/3 of the way into the talk, he gives his silver bullet. And what he says is, the key to high performance is not rewards and punishments, but that unseen intrinsic drive to do things because they matter.
Yep.
Okay, so first, I want you both to notice something that fits that format that I just laid out for you, right? The key to this is not this, but rather this, right? But the other thing is that becomes powerful because someone could hear that sentence and nothing else and actually start forming ideas as to how to motivate higher performance in their team. The reason why a silver bullet is so powerful is because it empowers without any other context. It leads to that lightning bolt epiphanous moment because someone suddenly gets something. And so someone listening to just Dan Pink say that one sentence, they can say, oh, I shouldn't be using carrots and sticks. I should just go and talk with each employee and make sure that they know how it matters to the organization and to all of us.
Right.
And that's pretty good for one sentence. That's why it's quoted on, you look up Aristotle or any of these people on Braining Quote, and you see all these cause and effect sentences, these silver bullet-like sentences that are sticking around thousands of years later because of that sudden empowerment.
Yeah. Does it matter where you place your silver bullet? I mean, if we're talking about a longer sort of thing, because your elevator pitch, it's 30 seconds, so you're going to get it out there fast. But if you're talking a TED Talk, a keynote 45-minute speech, an article, 500 words, does it matter where you put that?
I like to say that the only hard and fast rule of communication is that there are no hard and fast rules.
Right.
That being said, when I studied the top, I think now, because there's been some changes, it probably accounts for about the top 60 or 65 TED Talks of all time. Almost none of them place their silver bullet. The ones that do have a silver, not everyone does, but almost all of them do. And the ones that do have a silver bullet place it somewhere in the second half of the talk. A couple of them have them at the beginning. It's uncommon. Only one of them has it as the title of the talk, which is Amy Cuddy's Body Language Shapes Who You Are. And they softened on it a little bit as the research got some holes poked in it and stuff like that. But the Once Upon a Time, the title was the silver bullet and all of that. Most of the time, it's not something to shout from the rooftops. It's to build up to it. When I'm working with folks, I like to treat a talk not as much like a meandering, oh, we're gonna talk about this, now we're gonna talk about this. Like here's one step and here's another and here's another and here's another. I like to build up to a climactic moment where using mystery, building anticipation gets people really hungry. What was it that caused this amazing outcome for her? Well, that's what I'm here to talk about.
It was almost like an outline of a story, outline
Right.
of,
It's like
of
it's
a
like a
movie or,
screenplay for a movie. Exactly. There, Avengers Endgame shattered every box office record there was. It's the highest grossing movie of all time. And that's because what? The end of Infinity War, it was a two-parter, right? The Infinity War and Endgame was a two-part thing, one year after the other. And Infinity War left us with such a cliffhanger that everyone who either watched the original in the movie or watched it on Netflix or Amazon or whatever it is, they all got into, oh my God, what's going to happen to all these characters whom I've loved for so many movies? And so it just shattered box office records because anticipation was such a driving force. So why not borrow from that in your speech and create that same sense of anticipation?
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, perfect. Love it.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, that's so great. That anticipation, you know, the more I think about it, I'm now thinking about like all my TV shows that I watch, right? Like this idea of how you really do build anticipation and how we could do that with even the most inane, kind of boring HR audits. Let's build some anticipation.
Well, you say that, Lisa, but if you had a silver bullet-like statement that changed the game on how to do audits, the problem with how we usually do audits is that we blank. But the actual way to do an audit is blank. And if you had that kind of conciseness, that game-changing idea is worthy of the anticipation you're building up in your talk.
Yeah, I mean, I use HR audits. Yeah, I use HR audits because it's usually like it's a running joke here, but I think it's
Sure.
I think it would actually like go up a level. It's like the problem with why we dismiss HR, right? Is
Sure.
because we think it's not important. But the reality is, and then I got to fill in that last blank, but
yeah, well, the key there is just understanding the essential value of HR. And how does that bust some sort of...
if you've got people working for you, you need to understand how to manage them effectively. And it's not just compliance, it's also motivation. And
right. Yeah. Right. So there might be something to how HR becomes a real asset for motivating and engaging your workforce. And the key to engaging your workforce is not through forcing compliance, but rather through, and then something that might not be too dissimilar from what Dan Pink talks about or something like that.
Right, exactly.
But the point is that you could just say the key to utilizing HR is not through forced compliance, but rather inspired action, something like that.
Oh God, I love you. It's so great. Geez, Neil, how excellent. I am wrapped all the way through. Fantastic. I loved what you've had to say. And I really do hope that people just listen to this and get it, because it's golden. Well, no, it's silver.
Silver. Yeah. Silver that's available for promotion. We can call it platinum since they look similar.
All right. So before we let you go, what is the main takeaway that you want for our audience to have about this?
I can answer that, believe it or not, by talking about something that happened when I was, and bear with me on this, it's not as heavy of a story as it sounds, when I was actually eulogizing my father, who sadly passed away about 1.5 years ago. Yeah. And because, when you're a consultant for public speakers and you're eulogizing your father, you're not going to just like do any old eulogy. You're going to bring all of the strategies and all of that. That's, I guess, how I found a way to grieve myself. And so I get up there and I start telling a story about how my father, when he took me to the supermarket when I was about 10, we encountered this big open vat of jelly beans where you scoop them into a bag and pay by the pound. But my dad liked to do things not because he should, but because rather what he wanted to do. And so he went over and just, hey, jelly beans. And he just took a few jelly beans and ate them. And I was half amused and half mortified. But I started telling the jelly bean story at the beginning of my father's eulogy, and my aunt, his sister, who's just a lovely but 100% embodiment of a Jewish woman from Brooklyn. I started telling the jelly bean story, and she just says in the middle of my eulogy from the front row, "That's the story you're gonna tell?" And I
Oh.
just kind of soldiered on. I made brief eye contact, but I didn't let that trip me up. And I just told how he was a teacher who he just really got all of the problem kids, all the kids that other people would have considered delinquents. He was a sixth grade teacher. He got all these kids, and what he should have done is treated them like delinquents. But again, he was a man who didn't do what he should do, but rather what he wanted to do. And what he wanted to do was treat them like stars. And by the end, and I made that point that his life was a reminder to do what we want to do rather than what we should do.
Mm-hmm.
And by the end, my aunt was, she had this kind of warm, almost teary smile, and she called me a week later to say that she really appreciated how she just had never really thought of her own brother in that way before, and just was glad for the opportunity to reflect on that. From the beginning of the eulogy, it seemed like it was a crash and burn because it was getting interrupted and she was incredulous over the trivial story about the jelly beans. But afterwards, she acted and she really appreciated something, and she took action in a meaningful way as a result of what I said. And that's all to come to the larger takeaway that you originally asked me about, is that the value of our message isn't based on what we say, rather what our audience does once we're done saying it.
Oh God.
Ooh, cheers.
Wow.
That
So
was
that's
great.
what I want everyone to think about and reflect on, is that you'll say, maybe you get your silver bullet right, maybe you don't, but if people do amazing things in response to something you said, that's what really matters.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh,
Fantastic.
love it, love it, love it. So Neil, where can people find you?
Best way to find me is on my website, neilcanhelp.com. And a fun-loving thing that you can get started with is a speaker quiz where you find out what kind of speaker type you are, so you can be instantly captivating in a way true to your personality. And you can find that on the site, or you can go right to neilcanhelp.com/quiz.
I'm so going to go
Perfect.
take that quiz like right now.
Me
when we're
too. I
done.
love quizzes.
That's why we do them, right? That's why we do them.
Great. So Neil, thank you so much for being with us. I have absolutely loved this conversation. But mostly thank you for being our badass of the week.
For real.
Well,
Thank
I
you.
appreciated being here to spend time with the both of you. And I'm also really glad we got to do some practical stuff during our time.
Yeah.
Us too. Thanks, Neil.